Hey folks, I've recently completed multiple different test runs from 1 to 85 in order to find the fastest leveling route from Mists of Pandaria Classic. All of these runs were done solo, and although I generally used heirlooms during my testing, the route shown in this video is designed to work even if you're brand new and have no experience modifiers at all. Also, while I did do some of my testing with monks, this route is intended to work for all races and classes, and will not assume that you have any monk-specific buffs. However, I will briefly touch upon a few monk leveling tricks in a later section of the guide. Since this is obviously a pretty beefy video, I'll quickly show on screen how the different sections will be broken down, and you can find timestamps in the video description that'll take you to each one. As you can see, most sections will be shared between both factions, as the routes have considerable overlap. Only the 10 to 35 routes will be specific to Horde or Alliance, so you can simply skip past this section for your opposing faction if you don't care about that info. With all of that out of the way, let's jump into the leveling guide. Before we discuss the route, I want to go over a few important bits of information that apply to the leveling guide as a whole. For starters, I'm sure many people are wondering how dungeon spamming will stack up compared to questing. In this version of WoW, dungeon spamming is generally better than it is in retail. However, this only applies to specific level ranges. As a general rule of thumb, I would not advise spamming dungeons unless I specifically tell you to do so within the guide. That being said, it is often worth completing every single dungeon at least once in order to finish the in-dungeon quests, as these tend to give a large chunk of experience. There are some exceptions here, such as Wailing Caverns, Blackrock Spire, or any of the Caverns of Time dungeons. Generally, these will take way too long to finish at their respective levels to justify getting the extra dungeon quest experience. As we go through the guide, I'll point out multiple segments where dungeon spam tends to be faster than questing, but you should always keep in mind that single dungeon completions for the quests are generally worth doing as you follow my route. That being said, it's important that you never specifically queue for any dungeon, as the random dungeon bonus experience is one of the main things that makes dungeons efficient. Additionally, as you quest throughout the Kata revamp zones, there's a chance you'll encounter a rare mob, and killing them will give roughly a quest's worth of experience. Obviously, your chances of finding any individual rare are low, and I wouldn't recommend going out of your way to look for them, but it can be helpful to know their locations as you quest throughout a zone. In case you want some help with this, I've included a link in the video description to a very old website that details the spawn locations for rare mobs in every Kata revamp zone. Oftentimes while following my route, you may notice that your quests turn green, and this will happen frequently if you have multiple heirlooms equipped. Don't panic, as a quest turning green doesn't actually cause it to give less experience. It's simply the game's way of telling you that it's meant for players of a lower level. This is usually irrelevant as far as my route is concerned, since it's better to do efficient green quests that require minimal travel time instead of spending hours traversing the continent just to quest in an area for your specific level range. Upon reaching levels 20, 40, 60, and 70, you'll be able to train a higher level of your riding skill, which is what you'll need in order to use mounts. At level 20, you can learn basic 60% speed ground mounts. At level 40, your ground mounts will move at 100% speed. At level 60, you can train 150% speed flying mounts, in addition to the ability to fly within the Old World and Kata zones. And finally, at level 70, you can learn Artisan Riding, which brings your flying mounts up to 280% speed. You'll also need to learn Cold Weather Riding at level 68 if you want to fly your mounts within Northrend. All of this training will cost a notable amount of gold, especially Artisan Riding, which requires 5,000 gold. If you're brand new, you'll also need to purchase an actual mount for your first character, but all mounts are account-wide unlocks and can be reused for any additional characters you level. It should go without saying that returning to Stormwind or Orgrimmar and training these skills the moment they're available will help improve your leveling speed, but obviously that may not be possible if you don't have enough gold. If you aren't able to afford Artisan Riding, I generally feel that dungeon spamming becomes a more appealing leveling method from 70 to 80, so keep that in mind when I discuss that portion of the guide. Finally, Mists of Pandaria is the first expansion to introduce the Darkmoon Faire XP buff to the game. The Darkmoon Faire is available every 2 weeks in Classic, and you can tell if it's up by checking your in-game calendar. If it's active, you can speak with a Darkmoon mage in one of your faction's major cities to be teleported directly to the fair. Once you've entered Darkmoon Island, you'll want to enter the fair proper and locate the carousel. Speak to the nearby panda named Katie and purchase a carousel ride ticket in order to sit on the carousel and receive a 10% experience buff. You're able to stack this buff up to a duration of 1 hour, and although it expires on death, you can return to the fair and refresh it as many times as you'd like. The last thing I want to touch upon before discussing the route is a few general tips for monks. First, and most obviously, upon reaching level 20, you'll learn an ability called Zen Pilgrimage. This will teleport you to a region in Pandaria called the Peak of Serenity, and in this area you can pick up and complete quests that will give you a 50% experience buff for 1 hour. The duration of this buff stacks, so for instance, if you complete 2 quests back to back, you'll have a 50% buff that lasts for 2 hours. You'll unlock a new training quest every 10 levels, and you can also complete a daily quest that gives you an additional hour of this buff. For this reason, many players opt to level their monks over a longer period of time by stacking up a gigantic enlightenment buff before doing all of their leveling. However, this isn't the only major advantage provided by the Peak of Serenity. Within the main building, you can find portals to Orgrimmar and Stormwind, and this gives monks incredible flexibility for traversing the world. Specifically, you can use Zen Pilgrimage immediately upon hitting level 20 to complete your Enlightenment quests. You can then teleport back to your major city, learn riding, and then use the Zen Pilgrimage return spell to be snapped directly back to your previous questing zone. This same trick will also allow you to save a ton of time when learning the riding skills at higher levels. Lastly, if you speak with the vendor Master Chang, you're able to purchase extremely powerful food buff items for either agility or intellect. Despite being incredibly cheap to purchase, these food buffs are actually best in slot all the way until reaching level 80, at which point they're only marginally weaker than high-end Cataclysm food. I recommend buying a bunch of this food upon your first visit to the Peak of Serenity, as it'll save you a good amount of time throughout the leveling process. Now that we've covered all of that crucial information, we can finally begin talking about levels 1 to 10. As you may expect though, this is the most straightforward section of the guide, as you'll always want to quest within the starting zone of your selected race. Travel time takes forever at this level, and 1 to 10 is very fast, so it's never going to be worth going out of your way to switch continents for a marginally faster leveling zone. That being said, the best 1 to 10 zone for Alliance is unquestionably Elwynn Forest, and Tirisfal Glades tends to be marginally faster on the Horde side, but the difference is much smaller when compared to Elwynn. If you're playing as a Panda, Goblin, or Worgen, you'll need to complete the entirety of your starting zone before you can follow the rest of my guide. Oftentimes, you'll find yourself exiting the starting zone at levels 11 to 14 depending on how many heirlooms you have, and this can make the 10 to 20 process a bit awkward since most quests that I recommend will already be green. As previously mentioned though, this isn't that big of a deal, and my recommended zones will still be the fastest way to level. For any other races, you should ditch your initial starting zone immediately upon reaching level 10 and begin following the 10 to 35 portion of my guide. For Horde players, you'll want to begin your questing journey here in Silverpine Forest. Obviously, this is pretty easy to reach for anybody who started as undead, but most other races will want to get there by taking a Zeppelin. The Zeppelin to the Undercity can be found here in the center of Orgrimmar, and it'll take you to this area in central Tirisfal Glades. Blood Elf players will instead need to make their way over to Silvermoon City and take the Orb of Translocation, which can be found in the back area of Sunfury Spire. This will drop you off in the outside area of the Undercity, and from here, all races can simply follow the road down south, which leads towards Forsaken High Command, the start of the Silverpine Forest questline. From here, as long as you pick up and complete every quest that you encounter, you'll be taken on a fairly linear path throughout the zone. Silverpine is deceptively efficient, as it has a lot of unskippable cutscenes early on, which makes the questline seem very slow. That said, the last 2/3 of Silverpine have incredible quest density and minimal travel time, so this more than makes up for the slow start. Midway through the questing experience, you'll get sent down into Gilneas. Don't panic, as this is simply an extension of the Silverpine questline. Within the first area, you'll see a giant Eden named Korok the Colossus, and you should kill him in order to receive a hidden quest. From here, continue along the questline in Gilneas until you've returned to Silverpine. Towards the end of the zone, you'll reach the quest Sowing Discord, which tasks you with killing a campful of elite dwarves. It can be fairly difficult to solo these mobs, as their auto attacks hit extremely hard. If you find yourself struggling with this quest, I'd recommend dragging the mobs over to Lord Godfrey and waiting for him and the other NPCs to whittle the dwarves down. Immediately after completing this quest, you should kill one of the nearby crocodiles, as it begins a hidden quest called From the Belly of the Beast. Obviously, Silverpine Forest is a fairly lengthy zone, and if you have heirlooms, you may reach level 20 long before you finish the entire questline. Generally speaking, I'd recommend only sticking around for about 1 to 2 levels until you're about level 22, and then you should move on into Hillsbred Foothills, as this is one of the most efficient zones in the entire game. You'll start the questline in this zone by picking up Welcome to the Machine over by South Point Gate. And just as before, Hillsbrad is a fairly linear zone, so as long as you pick up and complete every single quest that you encounter, you'll eventually finish the entire thing. There's only 2 quests in particular that I would recommend avoiding. You'll receive Stag Witches towards the end of the zone, and although it seems fairly simple, the drop rate of its quest item is extremely low, so it's usually not worth completing. There's also a small chain in the east that starts with a Haunting in Hillsbrad, but the density here is quite low, so I would recommend skipping it. However, you will still want to make sure that you complete the other 2 nearby quests called Extinction and the Durnhold Challenge. It's worth noting that some quests in Hillsbrad, such as Yetimus the Yeti Lord or the Durnhold Challenge, require you to fight elites tuned around a group of 3 or more players. For most classes, these are extremely hard to solo, but it is definitely possible, especially if you have a full set of heirlooms. I would recommend trying it once if you're confident, but if you can't solo them, just ask for help in general chat. There's usually a few people that are willing to group for it. Also, when fighting Yenimus, I would recommend dragging him inside of the nearby Yeti cave, as this allows you to negate his knockback mechanic. The fight will still be very difficult due to the damage of his auto attacks, but at least you won't risk dying of fall damage. This is where horde questing gets a little bit fiddly, as with heirlooms, I will often stay in Hillsbrad all the way up to level 30, well beyond the recommended 20 to 25 range. This is primarily because Arathi Highlands, while the recommended zone for this range, is really inefficient and has a lot of travel time, so I generally speaking avoid this place like the plague. I will at least give an honorable mention to Stone Talon Mountains, which is a very good questing zone from 25 to 30. However, it takes a lot of time to travel all the way from Orgrimmar in order to reach this place, and none of the subsequent zones are really efficient, so in my opinion, it's far too isolated to be worth doing. That said, if you're looking to spice up your horde leveling process, I cannot recommend Stone Talon Mountains highly enough, as in my opinion, it is one of the most fun Kata revamp zones that you can play. Horde faces a similar dilemma from 30 to 35, as it doesn't really have any good options for questing. The obvious solution here is the dungeon spam, but I will give an honorable mention to the hinterlands, as its close proximity to Hillsbrad foothills makes it fairly easy to reach, and the area around Reventusk Village has an extremely high density of quests that are generally speaking worth doing. The only problem is that after you finish everything in Reventusk, there's generally not enough quests to cleanly get you to 35 without running a few additional dungeons. However, the moment you reach level 34, you'll already be able to enter Western Plaguelands, which is the next zone in the route. For Alliance players, things are pretty interesting immediately at level 10, as you have an early choice to make. You could either choose to quest in Loch Modan, which has a level range of 10 to 20, or you could quest in Westfall, which has a range of 10 to 15, and then move onto Redridge Mountains, which has a range of 15 to 20. This decision is a little bit challenging, because as we'll discuss later, Duskwood will be the next zone in the route. It covers levels 20 to 25. And as this is very clearly the zone that you want to do for these 5 levels, it makes logical sense to go from Redridge directly into Duskwood. They are very close together, and Redridge is a very solid zone. However, Westfall is not a great zone. There are some okay quests here, but it definitely did not come out as a winner in the Kata quest revamp. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong decision here, it's mostly up to personal preference, though generally I feel that gnomes and dwarves would prefer to quest in Loch Modan, as they already start fairly close in Dun Morogh, whereas all of the other races would have an easier time traveling to Stormwind and then doing Westfall into Redridge. Speaking of which, if you're starting as a Night Elf or a Draenei, the fastest way to reach Stormwind is on this southern dock in Retharan Village, which will put you on a boat that takes you directly to Stormwind Harbor. If you're playing a gnome or a dwarf and you would like to go to Stormwind to quest in Westfall and Redridge, then you can take the Deep Run tram located in this section of the city. This tram will take you directly to Stormwind as it drops off in the Dwarven District. If you chose to quest in Loch Modan, then you'll start the zone here in the Valley of Kings. There's a lot of good areas fighting these trogs in Stone Splinter Valley, and you'll eventually be directed up to Thelsimer. This is the primary hub in Loch Modan. There's many quests in the surrounding area and the dried out lakebed that you'll want to complete. Eventually, you'll be directed up north to Algaz Station, where you'll complete quests within Silver Scream Mine, and after a long series of quests, you'll be directed over to the other side of the zone at Ironband's excavation site. The questline here will direct you over to Farstrider Lodge, which will eventually direct you back over to this section of the dried out lakebed, where you'll fight some Twilight cultists and clear out ogres in Mograth strongholds. As you quest through Loch Modan, you should keep an eye out for 6 interactable objects called Stolen Explorers League documents, as they'll give you a quest when you interact with them. A few of these are directly in your questing path, but many are off the traditional route, so I recommend looking up their exact locations in order to make sure you don't miss any. This may seem trivial, but each object gives a full quest's worth of XP for minimal effort, so it is absolutely worth going out of your way to pick these up. If you chose not to quest in Loch Modan, then I would first recommend heading over to Elwyn Forest and finishing up any remaining quests that are close to level 10. You'll find a bunch of these around Eastvale Logging Camp, and there's also the wanted quest for Hogger over by Westbrook Garrison. Once you're finished with that, and you actually make it to Westfall, you'll begin the questline over in the Jansen Stead, and you'll slowly work your way down towards Sentinel Hill. Generally speaking, as I mentioned before, you'll want to be leaving this zone as quickly as possible. I really do not like the quests here, but Alliance doesn't have many great options for 10 to 15 other than the aforementioned Loch Modan. And on that note, if you really wanted to, you could quest in Loch Modan from 10 to 15, and then go to Redridge from 15 to 20. But that's a lot of travel time, which usually isn't worth it at such a low level. In practice, it's usually just better to reach level 14 by doing whatever you can in Westfall, and then heading over to Redridge one level early than the zone recommendation. Once here, you'll start the questline in the southwest by the Three Corners, where you'll pick up and complete multiple quests that tell you to run around and kill gnolls along with other various wildlife. Eventually, you'll be directed towards the town of Lakeshire, and this is the main hub for Redridge. There's a lot of quests that direct you north into Redridge Canyons, and they'll eventually lead over to Alther's Mill, into Render's Camp, back down to Lakeshire, and then eventually across Lake Everstill to Camp Everstill. Now, everything that I've discussed so far is really efficient and should always be completed. However, the quests from this point get a little bit inefficient. It's still worth doing all of the immediate things around Camp Everstill, but eventually you'll receive a quest called Prisoners of War, which directs you east into Render's Valley. The quests from this point on are extremely RP heavy and take a while to complete, so I do not generally recommend finishing them. If you've managed to reach level 19 at this point, you should abandon Redridge and move on to Duskwood. However, if you are still level 18 or below, then I would recommend either running dungeons or just finishing the quests until you happen to reach level 19. Now, as previously mentioned, all roads will eventually lead to Duskwood. Although players questing in Loch Wodan could potentially move up to Wetlands, which isn't the worst zone ever, it has a lot of travel time for such a low-level zone, and I really wouldn't recommend it. I still strongly believe that it's worth hopping on a flight point and going all the way down to Duskwood, because this zone is fantastic. Duskwood is interesting because although it does have a lot of travel time between its various questing hubs, the overall quest density here is really high, so it ends up being really efficient. After you've completed all of the quests in and around Darkshire, you'll eventually be directed west over to the Volgol Ogre Mount. Complete all the quests in this area before traveling further on to Raven Hill, and then finish up all of the remaining quests in this zone. If you have heirlooms, you'll likely reach level 25 well before that, and that's okay. I would generally advise staying in Duskwood until you're roughly level 27 or 28. The next stop for Alliance players is in Northern Stranglethorn Vale, and you'll get there by taking this southern road in Duskwood, which leads into the Rebel Camp, the first major hub of this zone. Northern Stranglethorn has two major sections of quests. Some of them will direct you east into Curzon's compound, while you'll also be sent down to Nessingwary's expedition to pick up a lot of quests that tell you to kill various wildlife throughout the zone. Generally, I like to start by picking up all of the quests around Nessingwary's expedition, and then killing the initial wildlife in this area to receive the follow-up quests that tell you to, surprise, kill more wildlife. As you murder your way throughout the jungles, you'll eventually wrap around back to Curzon's compound, where you can complete the quest that you picked up at the Rebel Camp, and then return to the camp to receive your follow-ups. This process repeats a few times, with you grabbing new quests from Nessingwary's and Rebel Camp and circling around the zone killing enemies, until you're eventually directed towards the south, where you can grab a few more quests in Fort Livingston that send you into the Mosh-Og Ogre Mound. After you've reached level 30, you have officially entered the most complicated portion of the Alliance questing path, as all of the zones from 30 to 35 kinda suck. Here, you have a few different options. For starters, you could just dungeon spam, and oftentimes this is what I do to get from 30 to 35 regardless of the faction. If you would rather not do this, then I would recommend staying in Northern Stranglethorn for as long as possible, as there's usually enough quests to get you up to level 32. At that point, you could head down into the Cape of Stranglethorn and pick up the initial set of quests at the Explorers League dig site. This will send you up north into the Crystal Vein Mine, and eventually you'll be directed west towards the Nekmani Wellspring. Although I personally really hate questing in the Cape of Stranglethorn, there's no better option for the Alliance. And it's also critical because you'll eventually need to travel towards Booty Bay the moment you hit level 34. At this point, you're able to speak with an NPC in the town called Warmage Aurelier. He'll offer you a quest called The Battle for Anderhall, and he'll open up a portal that directs you all the way over to the Western Plaguelands, the next zone in the route. As previously mentioned, both factions will find themselves in Western Plaguelands for 35 to 40, as it is undoubtedly the best questing zone in this range. Alliance will obviously begin directly into Anderhall after receiving their teleport, and you'll complete a bunch of quests in this area before heading south to Chillwind Camp and completing all of the quests in this part of the zone. Horde players could choose to start in Anderhall, but generally it'll be easier to travel to the Bulwark, which is on the eastern end of Tirisfal Glades. These quests take place in and around Fellstone Field and Dowson's Farm, and they tend to mirror the stuff that Alliance does down in Chillwind's camp. Eventually you'll be directed to fly over to Anderhall and complete the quests in this portion of the zone. Generally speaking, if you have heirlooms, you should have reached level 39 by this point. This is usually a good time to head over to Eastern Plaguelands, as it's overall a much better questing experience than the remainder of Western Plaguelands. Both factions will eventually need to reach the neutral town of the Menderstead, which directs you up north towards Hearthglen and east towards Garen's Withering. If you're forced to still quest here until level 39, that's totally okay, as the initial quests in this hub are generally pretty efficient. However, the longer you stay in this section of the zone, the more inefficient the quests will get, as they become really slow and filled with roleplay. Eastern Plaguelands is where you'll be questing from levels 39 to 45, though if you have heirlooms, you may even be staying here all the way up to 48 or even 49. This is without a doubt one of the best questing hubs to come out of the Kata revamp. You'll begin the chain where I'm standing now, in the west part of the zone, by Fiona's Caravan, and the structure of the quest hub will loosely be based around this caravan. You'll start by completing a bunch of quests in this region of the zone, then you'll hop on the caravan for a roleplay ride down to Crownguard Tower. The caravan will then take a break as you complete all of the quests in the surrounding hubs, including Darrowshire, the Marisstead, and the Fungal Vale up north. After finishing all of the quests in this area, the caravan will take one final trip over to Lightshield Tower. Here you'll receive a series of quests that direct you south into Corrin's Crossing and Lake Merildar. And once you've completed them, you can walk on foot north to Eastwall Tower to pick up a few additional quests, or head over to Lightshope Chapel to continue the initial questline. At this point, Eastern Plaguelands branches out a bit, as the questline in Lightshope Chapel will eventually direct you north into the Noxious Glades before sending you west into Plaguewood. The chains in Eastwall Tower will direct you north towards Zulmashar, and there's another separate questline down in Tyr's Hand, which, in my opinion, is the best one in the zone, and you definitely shouldn't miss this. Unlike many of the previous zones where I advised leaving as soon as you possibly could, I think that you should do literally every single quest in Eastern Plaguelands, even if it takes you well beyond the recommended range of 45. The problem with heirlooms is that it's impossible for me to predict exactly where you'll be left off at after you finish every quest in this zone. Some people will be able to jump straight into the next portion of my route, which is obviously very efficient, and other people might find themselves stranded around the level 47 range and will need to get additional experience before they can follow the next step. Now, that would be fine if it wasn't for the fact that every single Kata revamp zone from 45 onwards is complete garbage. As usual, the obvious answer here is to dungeon spam, and there's a particular reason why this is really good that I'll discuss in a little bit. However, if you are really looking for a questing experience, there are only two viable options. The first and perhaps most intuitive option would be to head to Badlands, as that picks up at 45 directly where Eastern Plaguelands left off, and there is a quest here in Lightshope Chapel, and by hopping on this rocket you'll be sent on a roleplay flight all the way down to Fuselate by the Sea, which is the first major hub of Badlands. Unfortunately, this zone has a ton of travel and is extremely heavy on roleplay. I would actually argue that it could be quite fun, if that's what you're looking for, but in terms of efficient questing, you will need to look somewhere else. This becomes even more problematic because the follow-up zones are Searing Gorge from 47 to 51, which is okay. It has a few quests around Thorium Point that are relatively efficient, but overall this zone is very isolated, and I would not consider it to be one of the better questing hubs. There's also no great place to go from Searing Gorge, as Burning Steppes is not a good zone at all, so you'll usually need to make your way all the way down to Swamp of Sorrows from 52 to 54, which does have a set of semi-efficient quests in Stonard or Marshtide Watch, depending on your faction, but overall, this takes way too much time to reach for it to be worth questing in. Following this path, the ultimate idea would be that you end in Blasted Lands, but again, while there are some okay quests here, the zone is rather incomplete, and I generally don't feel it works well for efficient leveling. Now, there is one other option that is, in my opinion, mildly better, and that is heading over to Kalimdor and questing in Felwood. Although it will take quite a lot of travel time to reach this place for both Horde and Alliance, the quests here tend to be pretty good. You'll start off in the Emerald Sanctuary, and you'll work your way up north towards Whisperwind Grove. Eventually, you'll be directed through Timbermaw Hold into Winterspring, which is a level 50 to 55 zone. Winterspring is a bit interesting because I would say it does actually have a lot of efficient quests, but there is also a lot of travel time. While this is, in my opinion, the best zone from 50 to 55, it's still not a great option, and it pales in comparison to dungeon spam. Which brings me to my next point. Upon reaching level 49, you'll have a chance to encounter Blackrock Depth's detention block in the random dungeon finder, and this is where dungeon spamming goes into overdrive. Not only is this dungeon extremely fast and easy to complete, which allows you to farm a ton of random dungeon completion bonuses, but it also benefits from a weird quirk in the random dungeon finder. Let's say at level 49 you end up in this dungeon and there's a level 57 player in your group. There is only one eligible dungeon that you and the 57 player have in common, and that is Detention Block. If you manage to convince them to queue with you again, you're guaranteed to receive non-stop runs of Detention Block until your newfound friend reaches level 58. If you get lucky enough, it's entirely possible to level from 49 to 58 by only spamming Detention Block, and the experience gained by doing this is completely absurd. Even if you get unlucky every now and then, you're still likely to encounter Detention Block once every 2 or 3 runs. This setup, alongside the fact that questing is really bad from 45 to 58, means dungeon spam is the obvious choice for leveling in this bracket. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, as once you reach level 58, the Blackrock Depth spam trick will no longer function, as you'll outscale the range of Detention Block. You'll now need to move on to Outland in order to continue questing, and in order to reach those zones, you'll need to return to your respective main city, either Orgrimmar or Stormwind, and take the portal to the Blasted Lands that can be found in the Cleft of Shadow for Horde, or the Stormwind Mage Tower for Alliance. From here, you can simply run forward through the Dark Portal and enter Hellfire Peninsula. The early levels of TBC are a little bit weird, as you don't immediately unlock Hellfire Ramparts, and even when you do, it's the only available dungeon. While Ramparts isn't bad, it's also not necessarily the best spammable dungeon you can get, so I generally wouldn't recommend doing that over traditional questing in Hellfire Peninsula. Upon crossing through the Dark Portal, you'll receive a quest that directs you to your faction's nearby Flightmaster, and this will send you to either Thrallmar or Honor Hold, depending on your faction. Although the Alliance and Horde don't have the exact same quests in this zone, their paths are roughly mirrored, as both factions will complete quests around their starting town before eventually being directed west, out to Falcon Watch for Horde, or Temple of Tel Hamat for Alliance. Finally, there's a set of really good quests over by the Ruins of Shannara that are available to both factions. Generally, I'd recommend staying in Hellfire Peninsula all the way from 58 to 61. The quests here are really good, and it'll give you more than enough experience to eventually segue into Zangarmarsh. To kick things off, you'll want to begin questing in Cenarian Refuge, as this is one of the best hubs in the entirety of Outland. There's a ton of quests here that overlap around the eastern section of the zone, and you'll want to complete all of it before potentially moving on to Tel Redor for Alliance and Zaberjin for Horde. I say potentially because if you're entering Zangarmarsh at level 61, and you have heirlooms, you will usually get to roughly level 63 or 64 by the time that you've finished everything in the east, at which point you should move on to Nagrand. However, if you're still level 62 or just barely hit 63, it's usually worth staying a little bit longer in Zangarmarsh to finish up quests here. Additionally, this is a good time to start spamming dungeons, as by level 63 you've unlocked a lot of the really good TBC dungeons, so you'll have a nice pool to pick from. The first thing that you should do when entering Nagrand is picking up all of the Nissingwari quests in the northeast, as a lot of these can be done simultaneously while you complete other objectives within the zone. Alliance players will head south to Talar, while Horde players go west to Garadar. Once again, the specific quests that each faction receives are slightly different, but it'll generally send you to similar locations all across Nagrand. There isn't necessarily a correct way to quest in Nagrand. You're generally looking for a bunch of stacked quest objectives that you can knock out in between dungeon queues. The only really important set of quests that I would highly recommend doing in this zone is the Ring of Blood, which you can find up north by the Laughing Skull Ruins. The Ring of Blood is a chain of 5-player recommended quests that force you to kill elite mobs, and it's usually impossible to do this on your own. However, due to the reputation the Ring of Blood has as being a really efficient set of quests, you'll almost always find other people around here looking to group up for it. Don't be afraid to ask in general chat to see if anybody else is looking to group up. Upon reaching level 67, I'd recommend heading over to Netherstorm, as the quests within Area 52 are really dense and easy to complete. You shouldn't stay here for too long, and you should still be queuing for dungeons as you quest within Netherstorm, as at levels 67 and 68 you'll unlock Sethek Halls and Manchester's Terrace, respectively, which are 2 very good dungeons to complete. Generally, I'll stick around in Netherstorm up until 68 or 69 until I've finished all of the quests within Area 52. Your exact level at this point will vary depending on how lucky you got with dungeons, and, of course, how many heirlooms you have equipped. However, once you've completed everything within Area 52 and you are at least level 68, you should move on to Northrend. Northrend is a bit unique as it has 2 optional starting zones, either Borean Tundra or Howling Fjord. Both of these zones have the exact same level range of 68 to 72, but in all cases I would recommend starting with Borean Tundra as it is significantly more efficient for both factions. In order to reach this zone, Horde players will want to take the Zeppelin from Orgrimmar, while Alliance players will take the northernmost boat from the Stormwind Harbor. At the time of recording, it's still possible to speak directly with the Zeppelin or Harbor Masters in Orgrimmar Stormwind and be teleported directly to your starting hub within Borean Tundra. This was a mechanic that Blizzard added during the launch of Wrath of the Lich King Classic that they just kind of forgot to disable. So although it does help leveling speed currently, there is always a chance that they remember in the future and shut it off again, which will force you to take the boats. Blizzard, if you're watching this guide, please do us all a favor and leave the teleport in. I personally find it to be very handy. Just like in Outland, Borean Tundra will have a similar path for both Alliance and Horde, even though the exact initial quests are a bit different. The Horde will start in Warsong Hold, and they'll make their way over to Garrosh's Landing, while the Alliance will start in Valiant's Keep before making their way down to Riplash Strand. At this point, both factions will want to head up north to Amber Ledge and complete all of the quests within the subzone. Eventually, you'll be directed over to Kuldara, and you should complete every single quest within this subzone with the exception of the final one called Drake Hunt. Lastly, both factions should head over to the data camp in this section of the zone and complete all of the quests in this area. Before we move on to the next zone, I do want to make it clear that I do not recommend spamming dungeons at all during this range. Borean Tundra is extremely efficient, but Utgard Keep and the Nexus are not efficient dungeons to spam. You heard me mention earlier that you should at least do most dungeons once for the quests, but this is not necessarily true for Utgard Keep and the Nexus at your current level. For whatever reason, these dungeons do not go away for the entirety of Northrend leveling, so you're almost guaranteed to queue into them at some point when you reach a higher level. This means that if you run Nexus and Utgard right now, you're almost certainly going to get them as a duplicate later on, which will lower your overall efficiency. If you happen to have no heirlooms and you're somehow not level 72 after finishing all of the recommended quests, you can stick around in Borean by going north to Fizzcrank Airstrip for Alliance and east to Tonkalei Village for Horde. Next up, you'll want to make your way over to Dragonblight, and you'll be questing here pretty much the entire way up to level 75. Both factions will start over in the west, with Horde players beginning the quests in Westwind Refugee Camp, while Alliance players will head directly to Star's Rest and begin the questlines there. For Horde, you'll eventually be directed to Agmar's Hammer, which is your main hub in this zone, and it's where you'll pick up the remainder of the quests in Western Dragonblight. I would highly recommend completing every single quest that you encounter within this section of the zone. Both Horde and Alliance once again have roughly the same quests, and there's a lot of really good overlapping quests in Ice Mist Village, Moonrest Gardens, and the Ruby Dragon Shrine in the east. There's also a lot of easy to complete wanted quests here that give you great experience. Upon finishing everything in Western Dragonblight, you should head over to Wyrmrest Temple and complete the chains that direct you towards the various dragon shrines. At this point, you should be at least level 73, and this is where I would recommend that you start queuing for dungeons. At this point, Asdril Narub and Draktherin Keep are both in the pool, and they're relatively easy to finish. In conjunction with sufficient dungeon spam, this is probably the only bit of questing that you'll need to do within Dragonblight, and you'll then be able to move on to Zuldrak. However, if you don't have enough experience, Horde players can move down to Venomspite and complete the quests in that part of the zone, while Alliance players will move up to Winterguard Keep and complete quests underneath Naxxramas. Lastly, there is a section of quests that both factions can do in the Crystal Vice, but I would only recommend doing this as a last resort if you need to reach level 75. By the time you reach Zuldrak, you should be constantly queuing for dungeons as you quest for the remainder of Northrend, as there's enough good dungeons in the pool to make dungeon spam efficient at this stage. Zuldrak is exactly the same for both factions, and you'll want to start by doing all of the quests within Light's Breach. You can then head up north to the Argent Stand and complete all of the quests in the center ring of Zuldrak. Upon reaching roughly level 77 or 78, you should head over to the Amphitheater of Anguish, and this is Northrend's version of the Ring of Blood. Once again, there should be a lot of people looking to group up and complete the quests here, and you'll oftentimes find max level players who are able to carry you. Generally speaking, after I finish the Amphitheater of Anguish, I will only dungeon spam for the remainder of the way up to level 80. However, I usually have the luxury of leveling with tank queues, so that's a realistic option for me. If you really need somewhere to quest as you finish up the remaining levels in Northrend, I would recommend going over to Icecrown and beginning the questline in the Argent Vanguard. I'm generally not too fond of the chains in this zone as they have a lot of roleplay, and after finishing the Argent Vanguard, you'll have to make your way to your faction's respective gunship, either the Orgrim's Hammer for Horde or the Skybreaker for Alliance. As you can see in the map here, their current locations are displayed with a fancy little icon. Alternatively, you could head over to Storm Peaks and complete a few quests at Grommarsh Crash Site for Horde or Frosthold for Alliance, but neither option is particularly great. Like I said, I almost always dungeon spam for the remainder of the levels in Northrend. Now that you've reached level 80, you'll need to quest through Cataclysm. Right out of the gate from levels 80 to 82, you're presented with two completely different zone options, Mount Hyjal or Vashj'ir. It should come as a little surprise that Vashj'ir is significantly slower, as the questline features numerous lengthy sections of roleplay. This means you should always choose to level in Hyjal from 80 to 82. In order to reach this zone, you'll need to pick up the quest off your faction's mission board and take the portal to Moonglade within Orgrimmar or Stormwind. You'll then need to wait a few minutes while a green dragon slowly flies you up to Hyjal Summit, where you can begin the actual questline. Once you've arrived in Hyjal, there isn't a ton that you can do to optimize the questing process. Every single quest chain in early Hyjal is worth completing, and most of them are fairly straightforward. The only noteworthy thing about this section of leveling is you may want to stop questing in Hyjal after reaching 81 and complete a few dungeons in order to reach 82. The later stages of Hyjal can be a bit slow, especially once you reach the quests where you go undercover as an agent of the Twilight's Hammer. Additionally, from levels 80 to 81, the only available dungeons are Blackrock Caverns and Throne of the Tides. These are both relatively fast and efficient dungeons. However, you are unable to pick up the Throne of the Tides quests unless you've completed the entire chain within Vashj'ir, and as we've already discussed, doing that is highly impractical. This means that running dungeons from 80 to 81 is usually a bad idea, though this completely changes just one level later. Upon reaching 81, you're able to access both the Stone Core and Vortex Pinnacle. These dungeons are very fast and have multiple quests for you to complete. While I still wouldn't advise non-stop spamming dungeons at this stage, it is absolutely worth doing Blackrock Caverns, Vortex Pinnacle, and Stone Core at least one time. You don't unlock any additional options in the random dungeon finder until level 84, so you have plenty of time to complete these instances as you level up. Regardless of which method you've used thus far, upon reaching level 82, all roads will lead to Deepholm. In order to access this zone, you'll need to return to Stormwind or Orgrimmar and complete a short roleplay questline that takes you into the Maelstrom. This next level is extremely straightforward. You want to complete each and every quest you encounter within the zone of Deepholm. You'll also obtain a bonus dungeon quest for the Stone Core after finishing the zone, so if you haven't already completed the dungeon by this point, it may be a good idea to stop and do so before you head to the next zone, Uldum. Uldum will be unlocked after you've reached level 83, and unlike the previous zones in Cataclysm, you won't receive any free teleports from the questline. You'll be forced to fly down there yourself. If you have your Hearthstone set to Dalaran, you can use it and then take the nearby Caverns of Time portal to quickly reach Teneris. The questline for Uldum actually starts just outside of the zone in the southwestern corner of Teneris, and after interacting with a camel and watching a short cutscene, you'll be teleported directly into the center of the zone. You'll then need to complete a few introductory quests before once again being teleported to a town called Ram Kahen, which is the primary quest hub for the first half of Uldum. At this point, the zone will open up and multiple sets of quests will become available. Each one will direct you to a separate subzone that contains many additional quests, and while you will need to complete all of these eventually, the order in which you tackle them is entirely up to you. For the most part, Uldum will play out quite similarly to Deepholm in that the quests are relatively linear. They'll take you on a path across most of the zone, and after finishing them you should have reached level 84 at the bare minimum. Uldum does have one small difference in that there's actually a completely unrelated questline present in the zone, which you can start by speaking to Harrison Jones at Kartut's tomb, which is located in the northeast. In case the name of this quest giver wasn't obvious, the entire chain is filled with lengthy roleplay homages to the Indiana Jones movies. Since this chain is completely disconnected from the main Ram Kahen quests, and it takes forever to complete, I would recommend ignoring it entirely as you level up. For the final level of 84 to 85, the game expects you to quest within Twilight Highlands, but unfortunately this zone is complete garbage and should ideally be skipped. For starters, actually entering the Highlands is a fairly involved process, as you'll first need to complete a lengthy questline in either Stormwind or Orgrimmar. Alliance players will need to complete a bunch of quests scattered around the city, which culminates in you defusing a gigantic bomb beneath the cathedral. After finishing this, you'll board a plane in the Stormwind Harbor, which teleports you straight into the Highlands. As for Horde, you'll only have a handful of quests to complete within Orgrimmar itself, but you'll then be directed to fly north towards Bilgewater Harbor in Ashara. After completing a few additional quests within this area, you'll be able to board a Zeppelin which flies you to the Twilight Highlands, but unlike the plane that Alliance players take, the Horde Zeppelin is not an instant teleport. Just boarding it in the first place can take you multiple minutes, since the Zeppelin takes a while to actually arrive. If you're lucky, you may reach the boarding point after another player has started the quest, and you can board the Zeppelin instantly without waiting on the roleplay. After it takes off, you'll still need to wait through a few minutes of additional roleplay as the Horde air fleet approaches the Twilight Highlands. For all of these reasons, in addition to the generally inefficient quests within the zone, you'll want to look for alternative methods to reach level 85. The first and most obvious method would be to run additional dungeons, and this is an especially good idea at level 84 since you get 3 new options in the random dungeon finder pool. These are Grim Batol, Halls of Origination, and Lost City of the Tol'vir. While these dungeons are on the slower end, they're going to be worth completing at least once due to their quests. Even afterwards, it's probably going to be faster to spam dungeons than to quest in Twilight Highlands, as I can't stress enough how slow the zone is. With that being said, there is one efficient set of quests in the Crucible of Carnage, which is Cataclysm's version of the Ring of Blood. As usual, these enemies are extremely difficult to solo, and it's generally recommended that you form a group of 5. And with that, we've covered everything that you need to know in order to quickly level from 1 to 85 in Mists of Pandaria Classic. Later this month, I'll be posting a guide for 85 to 90 leveling, and when that's finished, I'll include a link to it in the description below. If you found this video helpful, I'd encourage you to subscribe and toss it a like, as that'll help other people find it as well.